The Catholic Church was for many a sole source of consolation. My mother was born in that watershed year, 1911. But if so many priests, brothers, and nuns were defined by a knot of viciousness, as the report suggests, is it enough to simply blame the Church, as a now secular Ireland would do? Is it perhaps that as a people, we fled into religion from cruelty, but the cruelty came with us? History had hardened the Irish soul. Yes, the perpetrators should be identified and prosecuted. And yes, the structures of the church that allowed for such clerical betrayal should be changed. But the abuse report requires a broader examination of conscience than that. My mother's rosary is my own personal emblem of connection here. Golden Bridge was a workhouse where girls as young as 7 spent their days stringing beads onto rosaries. Children who failed to meet a savage daily quota of up to 900 beads were beaten with the rosaries they had made, required to recite the Hail Mary while taking the blows. There is a perverse comfort now in blaming such a horror on the Sisters of Mercy. But for us Irish, this scale of evil demands a deeper reckoning. So, a deeper reckoning. I'm, like many of you, I suppose, sick of the scandal mongering. Sick of it. This morning's front page, Brazil, for God's sake. The antidote to this crisis is embodied in the tradition of this organization, which was the precious discovery of democracy, which means a people organized by openness, mutuality, pluralism, self-criticism, checks and balances, separation of church and state, a determination to submit to each other in judgment and in equality. The Roman Catholic Church, my church, condemned such ideas as heresy in 1899. The heresy was called, by a delicious irony, Americanism. And it was attached to the figure of an American Catholic priest named Isaac Hecker, who was the founder of the Paulist Fathers, which was the religious order to which I belonged as a priest, which runs the Paulist Center on the far side of Boston Common. Isaac Hecker was a member of Brook Farm, the idealist utopian commune that included Thoreau and Bronson, the transcendentalists.
Margaret Fuller.
Margaret Fuller. Thank you, Margaret. Your namesake, no doubt.
Almost.
Americanism was condemned as a heresy in 1899. And because of something else that happened out here, little more than half a century later, Americanism began to be embraced by Roman Catholicism. The story involves our beloved then Archbishop Richard Cushing, who gave me in that year my first lesson in theology. It was 1953. I was 10 years old. In 1953, out here on the Boston Common, there was a bit of a ruckus because of the preaching of a Catholic priest by the name of Father Feeney, who used to preach no salvation outside the church. What was that? That was the weapon we Catholics used to defend ourselves against overweening and at times oppressive Protestant military power and economic power. And we could establish a sense of selfhood by saying, we're punished in this world, but in the next world, we're triumphant. No salvation outside the church was the downtrodden Catholic response. And that's where it came from. And we shouldn't denigrate that. But by 1953, something else had been taking place. And Cardinal Cushing knew it. How did he know it? 2 blocks up here is a men's clothing store called Louis. Well, actually, they just moved to the new South Boston.
Actually, they moved.
But Louis was run by a pair of brothers, one of whom was named Dick Pearlstein. Dick Pearlstein was married to a woman named Dolly Cushing, who was an MTA token taker. And she was the sister of Archbishop Richard Cushing. And Richard Cushing had dinner with his sister Dolly every Sunday. And every Sunday he heard Dick Pearlstein describe to him what he was hearing on his lunchtime walks here in the Boston Common from Father Feeney, no salvation outside of the church, especially Jews. And Archbishop Cushing called Father Feeney into his office and asked him to stop. Father Feeney said, stop, but I'm preaching the doctrine of the church. This is defined by councils going back to the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas taught this. A dozen councils, every pope. This is the church's core teaching. And Cardinal Cushing said, yes, but I want you to stop. Cardinal Cushing had learned something from his brother-in-law. I love Dick Pearlstein. I see Dick Pearlstein's goodness. If I love Dick Pearlstein, how can God not love Dick Pearlstein? That's right. Richard Cushing put his experience above the doctrine, which is, of course, the democratic idea. How do we know that we exist? Not because God tells us, but because I think, therefore I am. It's the modern idea. It was the idea that came into its own in this country. In 1737 and 1738, they were in the throes of this idea that every person has a sacred selfhood to be respected. And therefore, your conscience cannot be intruded upon by mine. Therefore, the state has no right to intrude its conscience on anyone's. Therefore, the state must be religiously neutral. This idea taking form in the human consciousness at that moment, an American idea. And Cushing got it in the way that Americans have always gotten it, by rubbing elbows with people who believe differently than they do, which was the difference between this country and the old countries. You were next to people who believed differently than you did. You married people who believed differently than you did. And suddenly your belief looked different. And the absolute truth of your religion was not quite so absolute anymore. And it was that ingenious recognition, embodied by the people who established this tradition, that made this country the gift it is to the world.